The House comes to the debate on the Budget Policy Statement 2025 and Half-Year Economic and Fiscal Update 2024. Honourable Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it is a pleasure to take a call on this special debate on the budget policy statement, and I do promise no revisalism in my speech, because this actually is
The roof might fall in if you did.
Well, Mr Speaker, it will be far more mainstream, to which you and I are both accustomed. But, Mr Speaker, this is a serious debate, and one this Parliament should take seriously, because the Budget Policy Statement and its examination at the Finance and Expenditure Committee is an important part of the parliamentary process. It is where the government of the day sets out what the priorities for spending for the coming year will be, sets the economic context for the budget that it's going to deliver. Yes, it announces the date, but within a budget policy statement there is a lot of detail, and it actually does reflect the priorities of the government of the day. And I think if we have a look at the budget policy statement that was delivered and examined at the Finance and Expenditure Committee, rather than seeing a narrative of growth, as the opposition will tell us, it is nothing more than a pretty grim read in cuts. So if we have a look at the section, and one of the important things that a budget policy statement sets out, Mr Speaker, is the operating allowance. This is how much money that a government is going to have to allocate at the forthcoming budget, what that looks like. And we can see in the government's own budget policy statement that we have on page 3 of that document that there's going to be a high bar for new initiatives. And I think when we say a high bar, I think we say an insurmountable bar. So while there's an operating allowance in the forthcoming budget of $2.4 billion, after you take out the pre-commitments that have already been made, that is things that the government didn't fund in the last budget and realised that they needed to do some political fix-ups on in between budgets, we're left with an operating allowance of $700 million. And Mr Speaker, I cannot emphasise to New Zealanders how low that is. That is for everything other than health. That is to fund the cost pressures that we see in education. That is to fund what we might want to see in new initiatives in health. That is to fund any increase we might have in the paltry allocation we've had to housing in the previous budget. So there are not going to be new initiatives. There is the highest of bars that has been set by the government in this. Second, it's not only there's not going to be new initiative, what this budget policy statement lays absolutely bare, Mr Speaker, is that there are going to be more cuts, and they are going to be deeper. I read from the document where it says second, savings will need to be found beyond those already identified in the previous budgets. So what I say to New Zealanders is brace yourself. There is more coming. You thought Budget 2024 was savage? Hot on its heels is coming Budget 2025. And what it makes absolutely clear, in case colleagues thinking of making their bids hadn't realised just how brutal this budget was going to be, it says with a small number of exceptions, government departments should expect to receive no additional funding in the budget. So, Mr Speaker, what we can see is this is austerity laid bare. This is no new funding going in, but worse than that, Mr Speaker, it is more cuts. So if we are looking for what we need to do to fix our health system, to deal with the rising levels of homelessness that we are seeing throughout New Zealand by once again investing in housing, you will not see it in Budget 2025. The budget policy statement makes that abundantly clear. If we are looking for what we need to do to stimulate and drive growth, the kinds of initiatives that we might want to see in economic development, there will not be funding for that. That is not the kind of thing we'll see. And Mr Speaker, we know, we just need to look at the economic indicators, just how tough it is out there. We can take a pick of figures to look at that. Net core crown debt will peak at 46.5% of GDP. Last time it was this high was in 1994. And Mr. Speaker, when we come to think about the increased borrowing, let's take our thinking back to Budget 2024 and just how irresponsible it was of a government to borrow to fund tax cuts. That is becoming abundantly clear. We'll see that net core crown debt is 3.5 percentage points higher than it was forecast in the budget. So between May and December, we've seen that increase in terms of what net core crown debt has done. So when this government tries to blame it all on the previous governments, it's time for them to stand up and take responsibility for the budgets that they have delivered. We also see, and I think this is one of the most concerning things for us on this side of the House, of what this translates to for ordinary people. And nowhere is that more debilitating than the rising number of unemployed that we are seeing in this country. That is higher in every year of the forecast, and that is what the budget policy statement shows us. There is 20,000 more people forecast to be on the job seeker benefit and support by 2026. And Mr. Speaker, that is a direct response of the kinds of cuts that we saw in Budget 24 and that we are being told to brace ourselves for in Budget 2025. Those cuts will be deeper. We are not going to see the level of spending that we need to start addressing some of these issues that New Zealand is facing. Mr. Speaker, the other, notable thing about the budget policy statement, and an item that the Select Committee spent a substantial amount of time delving into, of course, was Obergell X, the new way of the new economic measure that was introduced by the Minister of Finance. And one of the things that we spent time talking to both the Minister of Finance and the Treasury officials, of course, is because Treasury had advised against the introduction of this new measure. And they had advised against the introduction of this new member because it would not allow for the continuity and ongoing comparison of the Crown accounts. So it's when you can't make surplus, you just take some stuff out to make it better, would be the short and easy description of what Obergell X is. And there is a reason why the Treasury advised against doing this, because for the Treasury, the ability for us to do year-on-year comparisons and to look at the economic situation across years is an important part of how we prudently manage our fiscal arrangements in New Zealand. So we heard that the Treasury, the advice to the Minister was that the short-term indicators, changing those short-term indicators soon after setting them, could weaken the government's fiscal strategy credibility, especially at a time when the fiscal outlook had deteriorated. They were particularly concerned that it was a change to those fiscal indicators in the kind of in the face of a deterioration in terms of what they were projecting. Now, we know globally at the moment, Mr. Speaker, that modelling and projections are challenging, and we have seen that over the last 5 years. And I think that what we have seen over the last 5 years is that we have seen economists and central banks struggling to understand the different factors at play. Even more alarmingly, what we also heard in the course of this hearing, Mr. Speaker, was just how uncertain place the world is at the moment, and how hard it is to factor in all of the moving parts that we're seeing moving around the world. So to change our fiscal indicators in terms of being told by Treasury that it could weaken a government's fiscal credibility, I think is a bold move for a Minister of Finance and for a government to agree to do. Because, Mr. Speaker, what New Zealanders need to see in this budget policy statement is an indication that we are going to have a budget in 2025 that will start supporting New Zealanders into work, that it will make jobs and incomes a priority, that it will make housing an absolute priority, giving people the security of the homes they need and the kinds of communities that they need, and that we also make sure that we are adequately funding our health system. So, Mr. Speaker, what we needed was a budget policy statement that prioritised homes, health and communities as well as all the things New Zealanders need, but we did not see that.
Chloe Swarbrick.
Mr. Speaker, look, I know that we are in the realm of post-truth politics, but I don't think that I have seen a clearer indication of the gap between rhetoric and reality than what we have contained within the budget policy statement, the rhetoric and the promises that this government came in on with regard to the cost of living, and the reality that is biting everyday New Zealanders as a result of the decisions that this government has made to knowingly, in its going for growth strategy, grow inequality, grow child poverty, grow climate changing emissions, and actually degrow the well-being of New Zealanders. We have some pretty vague statements in the budget policy statement, which were helpfully gone through by the Chair. He stated, and it's reflected in this budget policy statement from the Minister, that the government's overarching goals for its term of office are to, and I quote, build a stronger, more productive economy. But when you really start trying to get into the granular detail, there's just some vague gesturing towards the notion of education and skills, towards regulation, towards overseas investment, which I will come back to later for members heckling at the moment, for science and technology, which they have decided, the government has decided to cut 400 jobs in, and also towards infrastructure. We are understandably starting to see quite a bit of bait and switch, whereby we were promised productivity, but now the fixation and the rhetoric is on growth. And the question has to be, growth for whom? Who will benefit from this fixation from the government? Because what we have in the budget policy statement, and indeed the budget itself, is a government that is intent on crunching government spending from approximately 34% of GDP to 30%. And the government knows full well that private spending from households and businesses is not going to fill the gap. And that, Mr. Speaker, is one of the deepest ironies from this government that likes to call themselves good, sound economic managers, because the decisions that the government has made to crunch that government spending as a proportion of GDP and not see it filled by private investment has resulted in a deeper and longer recession, which again is hurting average New Zealanders. Every forecast for this economy shows that things are getting worse as a result of the government's decisions, that they have exacerbated this recession. The Reserve Bank initially indicated that we were facing just a light downturn. Now the growth numbers continue to get worse. This time last year, Haifu was projecting a 1.5% growth for this year, but the actual rate now is negative 0.2%. Meanwhile, next year's growth at the budget in May was projected to be 1.7%, but it's now projected to be 0.5%. This budget does not increase productivity. In fact, it actively, demonstrably, evidentially does the opposite. So what do we hear from the government about what their plans currently are? Well, we've currently got the Prime Minister embarrassingly simping to the international companies that he's got at his investor festival, asking them to fill the gap because the government refuses to take responsibility for building the infrastructure that all of us ultimately rely on. And that is because this government refuses to acknowledge the reality, which I might add many governments before it have as well, that you cannot build a productive economy on the sands of speculation. Mr. Speaker, we in the Greens believe that Aotearoa New Zealand can aim a heck of a lot higher than simply hoping to have an economy which is us selling houses back and forward to each other. This is an obvious monopoly system, and Mr. Speaker, we do not live in a game of Monopoly. We can indeed change the rules when they do not work for the majority of New Zealanders. So let's talk about that attempt at fiscal consolidation which this government is ploughing ahead with, whereby it is deciding to do so through a process of cuts, merciless cuts after cuts, instead of fixing the tax system. Because that tax system, which we hear them fire up about whenever we dare to mention the reality that the institution of the Inland Revenue Department in 2023 produced a piece of work which told us that the top 311 households own more wealth than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders. To connect the dots there, that does not just happen, Mr. Speaker. That is an active consequence of political decisions which have been made to see those top 311 households pay an effective tax rate less than half of that of the average New Zealander. And these guys have the gall to say that they care about hard-working New Zealanders. They are further entrenching a system, Mr. Speaker, which sees our nurses, our firefighters, our teachers pay an effective tax rate almost double that of the wealthiest in this country. And not only is that so deeply unfair and so deeply inequitable, but it robs us of the very productivity that they tell us that they care about. It robs us of the investment that we could be making in that infrastructure that all of us need. The fundamental problem with the economy and the tax system in Aotearoa New Zealand is that we overtax work and we undertax, indeed oftentimes do not tax at all, wealth. Now, the $14 billion in tax cuts which the government ploughed ahead with were promised to boost the economy and to boost growth. But as we can see, the government's decisions to hand out those tax cuts have in fact only exacerbated that recession and made things far worse. And New Zealanders feel it in their back pocket. Those trickle-down tax cuts are not making up for the cuts to all of the public services that all of us rely on, and the increases in fees for prescriptions, for bus fares, vehicle registration fees, and otherwise. We're also seeing the most, I think, immediately obvious manifestation of this government's fixation on privatisation with regard to the failure of their cuts to the per-child cost of the school lunch program, whereby we are seeing the little guy, those hard-working New Zealanders that they once said that they cared about, being screwed over, and multinational companies or domestic versions of those multinational companies ultimately now going bust. Because this program was always set up to fail, Mr. Speaker. This austerity approach whereby we cut costs, set up programs to fail, watch them fail, then blame them for failing, New Zealanders, I believe, can see right through it. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is no wonder that every other day we've got a new form of distraction politics from members of this government with their latest imported culture, woke wars, or whatever it is. But I think that it is far more profound that every other day in this House, we have the Prime Minister get up and say, in response to questions, particularly from the Greens, that rents have stabilised. Mr. Speaker, the facts are clear, and I would invite the members of the government to go look at Statistics New Zealand, the authoritative, non-partisan agency responsible for producing the database that we make decisions upon as a country, which tells us that rents have actually increased at double what CPI inflation is. That is not what stabilisation means, Mr. Speaker. Rents are double what we are seeing of average inflation. Now, Mr. Speaker, the fundamental point here from the Greens in this budget policy statement is that different decisions can be made. While the government has decided to fixate on, for example, mining, which is reflected in the budget policy statement report from the Finance and Expenditure Committee, whereby the Minister of Finance started talking about how we can apparently do this thing carefully, we have seen and we have heard from the government that their plan for growth in mining is to go from approximately a worth of $1 billion to $2 billion. They want to increase the number of jobs from approximately 5,000 jobs to 7,000 jobs. Mr. Speaker, this is worthwhile putting in context, because right now, the arts sector in this country, not particularly well renowned for being well resourced or supported by successive governments, is currently worth $16 billion, i.e. 16 times the mining sector that they want to supercharge. And it currently employs 117,000 people, far, far more than the 5,000 or the 7,000 that they want to increase mining jobs to. Different decisions can be made, Mr. Speaker. And the Greens have outlined our plan with Te Ara Anamata, whereby we have shown that we can reduce climate-changing emissions 5 times faster than the government's plan and their emissions reduction plan. But more so than that, we can reduce the cost of living and improve people's quality of life. Mr. Speaker, that fundamental decision looks like deciding to put the public good ahead of private gain. I know that that's a scary thing for members of the government, the notion that we collectively might look after each other and the planet that we live on. But those are the decisions that we are campaigning on, Mr. Speaker, and we know resonate with everyday New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, just in my final remarks, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the logic and the rationale behind this government's decisions, and frankly, it's clear at the end of the day, there are none.